The first source is by Frederick Law Olmsted, published in a collection called The Cotton Kingdom in 1861. Olmsted was an eclectic man, to be sure. He was an agricultural journalist. He was a landscape architect. He designed New York Central Park. But in 1853, he was commissioned by the New York Times to conduct a number of investigative tours through the American South and the slaveholding states of that region. And over the course of the next 18 months, he toured practically every part of the American South, compiling reports, sending them to the Times, and publishing them. And his intention was really to give northern readers who had no sense of the region, of the southern states, no sense of slavery, to give them an authentic, in inverted commas, impression of what slavery was like. The second source is by Solomon Northup. And Northup is an absolutely fascinating man. He was born free in Saratoga Springs in New York, whose mother was of mixed race origins. But, importantly, Northup was a free man. In 1841, he is kidnapped, and he is sold into slavery in Washington, D.C. And at that point in time, he had been duped into going south to New York City, initially to Manhattan, to work on a circus because he was an extremely accomplished fiddler. He was transported south, and he was then sold to a number of different planters in central Louisiana, particularly on the Red River. Finally, after 12 years in bondage, Northup encounters a Canadian carpenter who is anti-slavery himself, and it is that carpenter who writes letters north back to Saratoga to achieve and to require legal documentation that Northup wasn't true. He was indeed a free man, and indeed at that point he is finally liberated. And one of the problems of writing history and teaching history, in point of fact, is how do we recover the slave's voice? How do we recover those who actually were there? What did they think? What did they feel? These products, these slave-written products, often published with the assistance of the abolitionists, represent one version of slavery. Olmsted represents another version of slavery. If we were to go to a plantation archive in Georgia, in Louisiana, across the American South, you'd read documents written by the slave holders themselves. None of these versions are authentic in and of themselves. It's the task of the historian to essentially read against the grain of these documents, to push them back, to see what is probable, what is hidden, so that we assess these various documents in tandem, and to collectively they represent a version that we might call the nearest to the facts of American slavery. Both documents are suffused with 19th century text. They're melodramatic, they're in one sense romantic, but they represent wholly different impressions, and this is really the nature of slavery. If you read, for example, Olmsted's account, it appears that the masters and the slaves seem to have a relatively good relationship, and there's a sense of a kind of intimacy within the plantation world. By contrast, if we pick up Northup's account is suffused with violence. It's suffused with the realities, from the African American perspective, the realities of slaveholding, the realities of life in bondage. When we look at Olmsted, we look at the way in which slaveholders manipulate the slave system. They provide the African Americans with absolutely nothing within the plantation, and they make them use any money that they earn on Saturdays or Sundays to pay for the most modest of additional items, slightly improved food, plates, cups, the very raw products of life in a clapboard shack. Solomon Northup, of course, alludes to the fact that how significant this money becomes. That even though it is very small, the amount of money that is accrued by African Americans by Sunday trading, to those people in chains, the significance of purchasing cups, pails, calicos, of a very constrained commercialism, of a very limited commercialism, that for those people, that's enormously significant. The idea of ownership of anything in a system that denies fundamental ownership. If you put it in contrast to Olmsted, they look like completely separate regimes. They look like completely separate worlds, and it's the task of the historian to essentially place those two perspectives together and to tease out. Olmsted represents very much what planters wanted to think of the regime. Northrup, very much what slaves experienced of a regime.